Now we will move on to Nehemiah 2. Xerxes sends Nehemiah to Jerusalem. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Xerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in the presence before. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where the ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah, and the gates of the citadel by the temple for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites.
So that's the first part of Nehemiah 2, and we're going to go ahead and break down the Cliff Notes version of what's happening, because there's a lot that happens in 1 through 10, and then again in 11 through 20. So if you notice, he goes in the month of Nisan, and he had previously been told about Jerusalem's walls being burnt down in chapter 1 in the month of Kislev. So there was a time difference there that he was fasting and praying to have the opportunity to do something about the walls being burned and fixing the walls. So he's in front of the king. The king noticed that Nehemiah has a sad appearance. It surprised Nehemiah to be singled out for attention, and it frightened him because it was dangerous to show sorrow before the king, who could execute anyone who was displeased with him. So if you're sad, you really shouldn't be around the king. And so Nehemiah was a little scared, but he wasn't ashamed to admit his fear. He just refused to allow the fear to stop him from doing what God had called him to do. He acknowledges the king's position and clearly stated the reasons for his own sorrow. When we allow our fears to rule us, we make fear more powerful than God. Is there a task God wants you to do, but fear is holding you back? God is greater than all your fears. Recognizing why you are afraid is the first step in committing to God. Realize if God has called you to a task, he will help you accomplish it. And I love here the king says to Nehemiah, "What is it that you want?" And what's funny is one of the first questions that Jesus asked in the New Testament is, "What do you want?" And you see here how the king provides Nehemiah with what he needs. It says in Nehemiah 2:4 Cliff Notes, "With little time to think, Nehemiah immediately prayed." 8 times in the book we read that he prayed spontaneously. Nehemiah prayed at any time, even while talking with others. He knew that God is always in charge, is always present, and hears and answers every prayer. I know that those short prayers when I'm praying seem to work, and it may be because I've established that relationship prior, but just encouraging you that if prayer is new to you, it's not something you have to be scared of, and it doesn't have to be your grandpa's corporate prayer, right? It can just be a friendly conversation between you and God. Yeah. God, like you're talking to a friend or, your dad or something like that. The king asked Nehemiah how long he would be gone, and he ended up staying in Jerusalem for 12 years. After his prayer, Nehemiah asked the king for permission to go to Judah. As soon as he got a positive answer, he began asking for additional help. Sometimes when we have needs, we hesitate to ask the right people for help because we're afraid to approach them. Not Nehemiah. He went directly to the person who could help him the most. Don't be reluctant to ask those who are most able to help. They may be more interested and approachable than you think. God's answers to prayer may come as a result of our asking others. Nehemiah had position, power, and many good organizational skills, but he acknowledged that God's gracious hand was upon him. He knew that without God's strength, his efforts would be in vain. Do you acknowledge God as your power source and the giver of your gifts? And then last in Nehemiah 2:9, when Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, opposition greeted him. Opposition to rebuilding Jerusalem had been going on for 90 years by those who had settled in the area when the Jews were taken captive. In every generation, there are those who hate God's people and try to block God's purpose. When you attempt to do God's work, some will oppose you. Some will even help you fail. If you expect opposition, you'll be prepared rather than surprised. Knowing that God is behind your task is the best incentive to move ahead and face opposition. This sounds a little familiar. There's always going to be opposition to everything you do. Sometimes, a lot of times, life feels like, especially for us here since December, we've had some crazy things happen, and it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and maybe a half a step forward and 3 steps back, right? And this just really points out that if God is behind you and you're just being prayerful and you're asking for help, because that's one thing that we tend not to do. We tend not to ask people for help because it's pride. You don't want people to know that you can't do something. And so just really being prayerful, being open and vulnerable to what God has for you, and know that opposition will come, but God is with you, right? And we have to keep that in mind, especially in today's age. Things are going to go crazy, but we have to know that God is with us. We have to have that hope. And so hopefully you got a lot from that, and we will start to read Nehemiah 2:11 through 20 next.